Well, it's a great pleasure to be in Genova, and I've not been here before either, and I intend to, with Henrik Schmidt, we intend to study the inside of a number of the bars around the waterfront here by the time we leave. I wanted to open briefly in a fashion that may not be very familiar with many of you, but some of you may have suspected that I would do this. There is a superb poet by the name of Pablo Neruda, who wrote a very short poem about the oceans, and it's about the regenerative nature of oceans, and it's just exquisite. And I wanted to start with that just to set the tone here, because it's the land of the Renaissance. It's the land where science and art and creativity come together. It's called "It Is Born." Here I came to the very edge where nothing at all needs saying, and everything is absorbed by the weather and by the sea. And the moon swam back its rays all silvered. And time and again, the darkness is broken by the crash of a wave. And every morning, on the balcony of the sea, wings spread, fire is born, and everything is blue again, like morning, the rebirth. And to some extent, the title of this entire meeting, Discovering a Sustainable Ocean Energy for a New World. I don't know if it's a new world. I'm a geologist, so I consider this to be an old world. But discovering sustainable ocean is part of what I will try to contribute to. The energy side, I think, will probably take care of itself as long as we can keep the ocean sustainable. And what I'd like to really talk about in a broad sense is the understanding that the ocean itself is our planetary life support system. We are as dependent on the well-functioning ocean as a society and as a culture as the astronauts were on the backpacks they had jumping around on the moon, hitting golf balls into outer space. If those backpacks, their life support system, had ceased functioning, they would have had a very short time to do anything about it indeed. And I believe that the ocean is very resilient, but it is not infinite anymore. And we need to be aware of that type of thing. When you start thinking as a scientist about a planet or about an ocean, it's defining the system that matters. And bottom line is, our challenge is to optimize the benefits and to mitigate the risks of living on a planet that is really driven by two energy sources. All of us are familiar with the first, and the first drives many of the processes that we're most familiar with. I've listed them here. Some of the more important ones obviously have to do with hazards and photosynthesis and carbon cycling, things of that sort. I'm sure we'll talk about those in terms of sustainable opportunities to extract energy from the oceans. The other one, however, is very familiar to people like Tetsuro Urabi and Mark Hannington. The internal energy actually drives a number of other processes, and to some extent these war against one another. The internal energy pushes the mountains up, erosion and rainfall cut the mountains down. And so you can think this way about how the planet works. It's really these two major energy sources working against one another, or with one another in some cases. And recently, since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, 1800 or so, we've begun having a significant impact. We are now a significant agent, cultural agent on the planet. And the human activities clearly are beginning to alter the Earth's system, making perhaps the ocean vulnerable to stresses and perturbations, the outcomes of which we don't understand well enough. And that's my basic point here. And to redirect this course requires that we understand ecosystems much, much more thoroughly than we do now. Understanding ecosystems means we're dealing with complexity. Complexity is a very, very difficult thing to understand, because it may actually be that there are some systems, like our brains and like the stock market and a number of other, so the body politic, are so complicated that it's almost impossible to predict the outcomes. And yet, we're talking about our life support system here. So I've tried to capture on this diagram a number of the processes that are involved, and I've only got about 10 to 12% of all of the processes. one important thing about the complexity of the processes that operate in the ocean is they interact with one another. So the complexity is as n factorial. If n is a couple hundred processes, n factorial is a gigantic number, and it's going to be very difficult for us to begin to understand how minor changes in certain elements, like hydrogen ion concentration in the ocean, that is going to be an issue for us to begin to explore in terms of all the ways in which it has impacts on the ocean. So I've shown mostly here the processes that operate in the upper ocean. And of course, there are processes that are near and dear to my heart as a geologist that operate in the deep ocean. And the fact of the matter is, these interact and interoperate, and they have done so for at least 4 billion years. We do also believe that life may have originated on the planet at the interface between the undersea volcanoes and the overlying ocean. This is a challenging and controversial hypothesis, but it's a powerful element in urging many of us to begin to understand the kinds of processes that operate within the ocean, the deep ocean as well as the shallow ocean. And an example of the complexity is shown here. This is the sea surface temperature. The warm colors are warm water and the cool colors are cold water. And if you look at the boundary in the southern hemisphere between the dark blue, the light blue, and the green, you can actually see how complicated the interactions are because you see the contrast between the colors. And you can see the equatorial countercurrent streaming away from South America. You can see many, many processes here, including the Gulf Stream and the western boundary currents as well. Even closer, you begin to look in your own neighborhood, you look at processes that actually operate in the North Atlantic. It's very complicated. And this is only one variable from hundreds of variables. Imagine how complicated it really is. And I love this quote by Marcel Proust. The real voyage of discovery consists not so much in seeking new landscapes anymore, but in having new sets of eyes. And he was speaking metaphorically. We have new insights, but it could also be taken literally. And if you begin looking at it literally and start looking at what tomorrow may hold for us, those of us who study the oceans, recognize that there are emergent technologies that are being invested in very substantially by outfits that are outside of the world of oceanography, and that those technologies are not something that we have to pay for. We simply have to adapt them for use in the oceans. And the convergence of all of these kinds of technologies across the board into the oceans is going to represent, it'll be a signal of major progress in terms of understanding the oceans over the next couple decades, which I believe we have to take advantage of. It'll be an exponential effort, a growth effort in terms of understanding the oceans. I might also say that most of these technologies are also on a Moore's Law curve of getting better and better, smaller and smaller, faster and faster, and cheaper. That's all to the good, but to first order, we don't pay for many of them out of the pocket of oceanographic research, I should say. So power delivery, robotics under the ocean, ecogenomics, the ability to do genomic analyses without anyone being nearby. Digital imaging is a very rapidly growing and very powerful capability. Fiber optic cable is something that I know a little bit about, and it's totally revolutionizing our capacity to communicate among ourselves and between ourselves and the ocean, and I'll talk a bit about that. You do Google searches on a routine basis, ask almost any question, and within 0.2 of a second, you get 1 million answers. That's the cloud working in your favor. And nanotech, what can you say about nanotech? What I can say about all of them is that they are substantially enhanced. The potential of using them rapidly and effectively is substantially enhanced by using fiber optic networks under the sea with the ability to break the network and to put instruments in a wide variety of locations that are of interest to us. So the regional scale nodes, which is a part of the Ocean Observatory Initiative, was once called Neptune and now is called the Cabled Array. Stand by, it's liable to change again. But the bottom line, independent of the name, is that abundant power and unprecedented bandwidth is revolutionary in our world. And this is my main point of my entire talk. Delivering unprecedented electrical power and communications bandwidth into entire volumes of the ocean can dramatically accelerate rates of technological innovation, adaptation and scientific innovation. In my view, much of this should be focused on understanding our ultimate planetary life support system, which is the global ocean. So it's a big, big job for us to get to the point where we understand this. The National Science Foundation in the US, as well as many outfits, many countries around the world, have recognized for a long time the power of the oceans, and that they are complex, and that they are changing rapidly but unpredictably. And so we begin to realize we have to have a great deal more data flowing continuously into very sophisticated but not necessarily well-tested models in order to get in a better position to perhaps predict the outcomes of trends that we see that may ultimately be dangerous. And so I believe that OOI and other programs like it around the world will indeed transform the interaction between human beings and the ocean. I hope that that will happen very soon. So this is, in the southern hemisphere, there are 2 outposts. In the northern hemisphere, there are 4 outposts, and these are just a small group among the many of you who are involved in studying the oceans. The one that I am most familiar with and that I will devote most of my discussions to is the one that's in the northwest portion of the United States in the northeast Pacific. It's that small box off of Washington and Oregon. The vision of the entire OOI is to launch an era of scientific discovery and understanding across and within the ocean basins, utilizing, and this is important, widely accessible, interactive telepresence. We can be there without being there. And here's, very quickly, I know that a number of you are much more technical than I am, and I think it's important that you recognize the capabilities that we are trying to move into the ocean. It's 2-way, real-time interactions, communications. Data flows at the speed of light, basically through the fiber. And we have a number of junction boxes, well over 100 instruments, and is dramatically expandable and hardwireable to the internet. And this is the location. The landfall is at Pacific City in Oregon, and its backhaul is to Portland and the full internet cyber infrastructure. The far side, the one that I'll talk about a little bit later, is axial volcano, and I'll happily share some of that insight with you. One of the powerful aspects of using fiber optic networks in the ocean, if you carefully choose the locations and optimize the selection, you can do many, many simultaneous kinds of science that not only don't interfere with one another, but in fact contribute to one another, because you're collecting the data in coordinated and coherent spatial temporal context. And so you can actually do as many as 10 to 20, maybe 30 different kinds of studies in an area, and everybody gets all of the data all of the time. That's one of the background points of the whole thing. We use this cable ship, the Dependable, to lay about 900 kilometers of cable in 2011. This is one of our primary nodes. It's on the seafloor. It's a shallow water node, so it's protected from trawling with the ramped outside doors that can be closed. And it requires a big ship to put it in place. It's very heavy, but the scientific interface assembly can be slipped down inside it using an ROV, and we have done that in a number of cases. So by 2014, we had well over 100 sensors on this system, including live TV, live video. This is, L3 Maripro was the company that actually put the system together for us, and they did a fantastic job. We were just delighted by the work that they did. The center left portion is the working portion of the primary node, and those cables, each of those orange cables, go out somewhere to a secondary node, and I'm showing the secondary node on the right-hand side. It's smaller, it's got a titanium tin can, so to speak, and you can plug a number of instruments into that. So Most of the power is at the primary node. It's dropped to lower accessible forms of power and communication at the secondary nodes, and we have 17 of those secondary nodes in place. Those were all put in place as secondary infrastructure was put in place using this ship, the Thomas G. Thompson, and we have spent quite a bit of time. I personally have spent all the time at sea, the 48 days in 13 and 83 days in 2014, putting all of this instrument in place with a phenomenal team of people from the UW and from Oregon State. It's just a fantastic group that I've worked with. They're just excellent. We use the remotely operated vehicle ROPOS, which is the yellow system there. It's held by a crane. And on the left-hand side is the cable laying capability, so we can lay up to 5 kilometers of that orange cable, and that goes from the primary nodes out to the secondary nodes. On the right-hand side is a secondary node being deployed, and it has an instrument latching system that is industry standard, and it can pick up to 4,000 pounds easily. We have had an excellent relationship working with ROPOS, the remotely operated platform for ocean science out of Victoria. I'm again showing a little more than I probably need to here, but I'm very proud of what my team has done. I won't beat it to death any more than I can help. So this is what the continental shelf slope looks like off of Oregon right now. There are many, many instruments that are hardwired to the cable, and the data is flowing from most of them back ashore and is being archived as we speak. The two circles on the left-hand side represent a major addition to water column studies, and one is a profiling mooring similar to the McLean system that's sold from Cape Cod, and the other is a two-legged mooring that actually has a platform at 200 meters, and it has a winchable profiling device that can be totally controlled from land, and we get the information back all the time from all the instruments, from all of these systems. All the other installations are much more detailed than I should go into here, but you can check our website and you'll find them. This is a quick view of the deep water profiler. It goes from 3,000 meters up to about almost 150 meters. So it overlaps with the shallow water profiler, which is this one with the circle in the middle, shallow water profiler. Those are the instruments on the right-hand side. It's made of flotation syntactic foam, and it's got instruments attached to it. So it floats, and then we haul it back down when we are profiling. And then the platform at 200 meters is a huge, huge device. We launched 3 of those last summer. It took some major seagoing efforts on the part of a superb team of technologists on the deck to get all of this into place and actually working. So let me just talk just a little bit about, there's so many topics one could talk about, and I've chosen to address volcano hydrothermal systems since it is my specialty, but you can substitute your own favorite kind of science, whether it's fishing science or whether it's tracking marine mammals, or whether it's looking at giant earthquakes, or whether it's looking at landslides, or whatever the interest is, ocean acidification. You can apply, in any way, you can apply all sorts of innovative approaches, especially with the rapidly developing technologies I spoke about earlier. And let me just take you from where we're sort of in the Mediterranean, and you all know the mid-ocean ridge is about 70,000 kilometers long. It's the dark red feature on the planet, and we have a little backyard piece of the mid-ocean ridge off the coast of Washington and Oregon, and it's in the dark red there, and we're homing in on something called axial seamount, which is perched right on top of the Juan de Fuca tectonic plate. That's the caldera. The dark outline is a sunken crater in the top. It's about 3 kilometers wide and about 7 kilometers long, and it is at the interface between the Juan de Fuca tectonic plate and the Pacific plate. And it recently erupted in 2011, and the lava flow you see there is what came out in 2011. And it's slightly embarrassing that the eruption actually took place in April of 2011, April 6th. And it wasn't until July that we actually discovered that the volcano had erupted, because there was no listening device. The SOSUS array was inactive in that area, and so no one knew until they came and found the anchor and the release mechanism at the bottom of one of the moorings was completely encased in fresh lava. And then they deliberated on that for a while and came to the conclusion that the volcano had erupted since they put it out there. So if any of you need to work through that with me afterwards over drinks, I'm happy to help with the logic. And this is what the surface, to talk about a fecund environment, this is the surface of the fresh lava 3 months after the eruption. So it doesn't take long for these systems to become colonized. That's the picture of the caldera. And here is work done by Bill Chadwick and Scott Nooner. There was an eruption in 1998, and the seafloor began to recover. The seafloor dropped almost 3 meters, a little over 3 meters, in the middle of that caldera in 1998. And then it recovered. It was on a slow recovery, the spot measurements annual campaign. And then in 2011, the seafloor dropped about 2 meters in the middle of the caldera, and it began to recover, but something strange happened. You can see there's a kink in the curve, and it began rising at 4 times the previous rate. So it's rising at 60 centimeters a year a month ago. It was still rising very rapidly. And the projection was, well, maybe it's going to erupt relatively soon. And this is what the cable looks like. That's axial seamount. You can see the cable running across the tectonic plate there. Axial seamount is shown in the inset with 2 nodes, the primary nodes, the one that's up near the caldera and the one that's down at the base of axial seamount. And here's some of the terminology. Primary node 3B is at the top. The diamond vent is one that we discovered. What's the probability of this? We accidentally laid a fiber optic cable over an active hydrothermal system that we did not know about. So if you're looking for ways to discover new hydrothermal systems, I don't recommend that one. But it worked. And then the North Rift and the South Rift will emerge as part of the later discussion. Now, I want to show you, we did a sort of a seismic CAT scan. This is work done by a number of folks, and they're referenced here. And these are multi-channel seismic lines that were done with an industry standard ship that actually worked over axial seamount for a number of traverses and penetrated into the rock. And we were able to define the shape of the magma chamber beneath axial seamount. It's the reddish zone. And you see the caldera is outlined in gray at the top. And so we're going to take a quick look, and a lot of this animation is done by my colleague Mark Stormer. And the yellow is got a lot of crystals in it, and the red has almost no crystals in it. So it's almost all melt. And we think what happened in 2011 was a diking event took place, bringing magma to the near surface right along the fissure on the east side of the caldera. And this is how we've recreated what the lava flow looked like. The shape of the lava flow I'm showing you is exactly what it looks like, because we worked that out using autonomous underwater vehicles that can map to a decimeter resolution of the seafloor. That's how much magma came out, and we can calculate rather carefully how much magma came out. The other thing that happened is in 2011, we think, no one was there to check, was it produced, like other eruptions, it produced a megaplume, which is a very fascinating type of phenomenon. It has rise heights of close to 1,000 meters. They can form plumes that are 20 to 25 kilometers in diameter, and it carries novel microbes from below the seafloor up into the overlying ocean. And this has been going on, as far as we know, back at least 3.5 to 4 billion years. This is a phenomenon we know almost nothing about, and the possibility of sampling these things during an eruption is really pretty exciting. And the questions that we begin asking is, how do these plumes affect ecosystem dynamics? Remember, I emphasized that the balance in the ocean, it involves the balance among ecosystems, shifting ecosystems. Some of them dominated by diatoms, some of them dominated by coccolithophores. And it goes on and on and on and on. Well, on the sea floor, it's dominated by the base of the food chain, which is microbial. And the recent discoveries indicate that there's a huge number of viruses that are part of these populations. We don't understand the roles that are played by all of these very, very basic forms of life. So we want to set up a biogeochemical flux array, which has a box here that's 45 kilometers on a side, and we want to populate that. We haven't done this yet with the fiber optic cable, but the cable is in place, and with the right kind of support from the right kind of folks, we think we can begin to instrument that entire volume. And here's a quick look. The surface upper platform, the blue platform, is the surface of the ocean, and I'm going to pretend that we can see through the water when we break through it, and show you what our vision is of what we can do with the fiber. You can see the cable coming from the right-hand side up to the orange box. And all of these instruments could be hardwired to the, we're doing this with some instruments, but not this many right now. And this is a small advertisement from my colleague, Dana Yerger, who I think some of you probably know. Dana is one of the engineers that's involved in producing Sentry. Remember Sentry. It looks very much like a gigantic bar of very well-used soap with water wings, and it can float, it can rise, it can move forward, it can hover, it can do many things, and it's a phenomenal platform. So this is what we imagine in anticipation of the next eruption. It's pretty exciting if we could have this in place by the time that happened. Now this is for Hendrik Schmidt, who is next speaker. I showed this to him a number of years ago. This is what I call, it's a kind of a fantasy of John Delaney's, that we would have robots. The green balls are the communication balls, communicating by either acoustics or optics. The red balls are the location navigation balls, and the yellow balls have about 25 different sensors on them, and it can move around through the water, and it's coming up on a black smoker there, and it actually can then begin to move independently, and you control this from land using a system that basically allows you to look at it in 3D. So it would be a holographic projection, and you would be controlling this from land through the fiber optic cable, which has the bandwidth to handle all this. So that's years ago, Hendrik and I drank a lot of beers over this. And here's what we actually imagine. I mean, you know, some of this is Imagineering, I have to admit, and most of it's Imagineering, except the cable's on the seafloor now and it's actually working at the low, low price of only, it's not much more than $100 million. So the eruption is taking place now, we think. I mean, we imagine this in our animations. And this is the black plume that's coming out. That's the mega plume. And you'll notice that some of the mobile platforms are actually working through the buoyant part of the platform of the plume down and deep, and another one is looking at the neutrally buoyant upper part of the plume. This kind of work can be done readily, and something exactly like this was done in the Gulf with the Macondo blowout. So it's not far-fetched to think that we can do this. I am a volcanologist, so again, I'm afraid I indulge my fantasies on a regular basis, and here is one of them that we will use the Sentry vehicle to begin mapping the progress of an underwater lava flow as it moves across the sea floor, and be able to look at the chemistry that's coming out, the microbes that are released. We're really begin dissecting how an underwater volcano actually works. Okay, here's about, what, 3.5 weeks ago, I convened a meeting in Seattle to talk about how exciting it would be when the volcano erupts. And we had a 2.5-day really exciting meeting. And lo and behold, 36 hours after the meeting was over, everybody went home, the damn volcano erupted. It was unbelievable. That's the earthquake count by William Wilcock. All this data was available to all the people all the time. Any of you that want to look at it can get it from IRIS. And here's where the seismometers are. The green circles are broadband seismometers. The yellow circles are short period. And this is what they look like. The triangle is a short period. The silver sphere is actually titanium, and it's packed in sandbags to make it connected. And here on the seafloor are bottom pressure tilt locations, the 3 circles. And look at what happened when those earthquakes took place on the 24th of April. That central location inside the caldera dropped. You can see the precipitous drop. The blue line along the top to the left, on the left-hand side, is at slightly different than 1,510 meters depth, and it dropped about 2.5 meters in about 12 to 14 hours during the earthquake activity. And then the temperature nearby began to rise, and you can see the red line is the temperatures rising. And here's what the earthquake patterns, all of this data, by the way, is flowing ashore through the fiber and available to anyone who has access to the internet. So this is a different way of working the ocean. And these are all the earthquakes that took place in that cluster, again, calculated by William Wilcock, a colleague of mine. And so we know that something very substantial happened right about where the previous lava flow came out, but we don't see evidence right now for the lava flow on the seafloor from this one. Right now, it's not in the area that we think it would be, or it would have flowed right over the fiber cables, and we assume would have interacted with them. So we have normal earthquakes on the left, and we have weird waterborne noises on the right. And this is what they sound like. So these are not earthquakes. These are acoustic signals that are coming through the water column. We've never heard these before, so we don't quite know what they are. We imagine that they represent degassing episodes of the lava that's coming out somewhere on the seafloor, and we can't quite locate it, but we think it's well to the north, not where the previous lava flow came out. So it's pretty exciting. We are beginning to home in on where it is. But remember, all this has happened in the last 3 weeks, and Andreas has been very frustrated with me because I would never respond to his emails. But, you know, it's been 25 years in the making, and all of a sudden, it's like Christmas squared, you know, it's really fantastic. All right, let me move on so we can. All of this is available to all the people all the time. That's the main point I want to make. All right, so back to where my colleagues, Bill Chadwick from Oregon State and Scott Nooner from University of North Carolina. So there's the 2015 eruption. It's only a 4-year delay because of the increased magma supply from below. It's not the 13-year delay. So maybe we have set the cable up in the right place so that we will have, a much more frequent event. It's a mistake to assume that you understand a volcano having dated it only 3 times. So it's, we'll see how it plays out, but this is pretty exciting. Now, in conclusion, I wanted to touch on the ways in which we can do novel studies that maybe are things you hadn't thought about. I mean, I know each of you have your own expertise, but the Endeavour site, see the word Endeavour, is near where the Canadian fiber optic cable. This is, by the way, ocean observing in the Northeast Pacific as of 2015. The Canadians are in place and we are in place now. We started out together in 2000. So for those younger folks here, if you want to do something really unusual, make sure you give yourself plenty of time. Here's the Endeavour site, and here's what we have been able to determine. And Deb Kelly and I have worked on this for a long, long time. This is the faulting in the axial valley. All the faults you can see there have been mapped out using an autonomous underwater vehicle from Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute. The mapping was done by Dave Caress and Dave Clegg. And we think that the submarine system looks something like this. This is interpretation. Now, everything below the surface is interpretation, but there are constraints. There's incredibly hot water coming up specific locations that are nearby one another, but they are clearly not all coming from the same source. So we think that has to be a system. The reddish sausage at the bottom is probably some sort of a magma, the margin of a magma chamber. It's clearly much greater than 400 degrees centigrade, because sometimes we see 400 degrees centigrade fluids coming out the top. And the cold water must flow down and in and be entrained and heated and then rise rather dramatically along the branching hydrothermal systems. And at the surface, we see these large black plumes of 350 degree fluid coming out and mixing with cold seawater and creating tiny, what looks like black smoke, but is really tiny crystals of iron pyrite. And this is what those plumes look like, and this is what they come through. You can see this is a mosaic that's put together by my colleague Mitch Ayland. Some of these environments are beautiful and very, very dangerous. And here's what I wanted to share with you. We look at beauty and we listen to music, and maybe you're familiar with and you think that this is just a lovely scene, and you know, I think beauty is maybe different than some of what you folks think is beauty, and so a submarine hydrothermal system might look a little bit like a Monet painting. But all is not quite what you would expect. These are the creatures that live in that area that I showed you. And I want to draw your attention, and by the way, all of them are supported by microbial activity as the base of the food chain. But I want to draw your attention to the upper right one that looks like Jaws. This is what Jaws actually looks like. I think it's ugly. Now, look at the furry creature in the middle there, and watch that's Jaws in a fur coat. It's actually filamentous bacteria. But look, see the tube worm that it's nuzzling up against? Can you see that? I don't know if I have here. It's right here. Keep your eye on that. Do you see that? Yeah, that's what actually goes on. It's not like the moldow. And that event takes place on a regular basis because lots of the tube worms lose their heads, so to speak, in a fashion. So taking these approaches allows us to look at entire volcanoes. It allows us to look at tectonic plates. It allows us to look at microbes. It allows us to look at animals that we'd never seen before. It allows us to begin asking questions that we probably aren't going to answer within the lifetime of anyone in this room, like what are the origins of life and what are the limits to life? So this is really where we are at this stage. And as I wrap up here, almost on time, we did, about a decade or so ago, we went to sample one of these systems. And we used ROPOS. We put a cage on the cable. You can see the cage in place there in the middle. We used a chainsaw to buck through about half of the black smoker chimney. And then we tied a heavy-duty lift line that was neutrally buoyant. We floated it to the surface, and we reeled it in at the surface, and we pulled on board a gigantic piece of rock. Now, on the right-hand side, you see 3 days later, you see about 2 meters of rock grew back in place. So these are interesting systems, and we found that the very high-temperature microbes live inside the walls of these systems. How can we use these microbes? What are they valuable for? Pharmaceuticals, biotechnology? We don't know. We don't know. But many people think that the moons of Jupiter, shown here, the gold one is Io, the whitish brown one is Europa. Io is the most volcanically active body in the entire solar system. You can see 2 eruptions taking place. On the limb over here, you can actually see right here. That's an active volcano erupting about 100 kilometers above the surface. And there's another one here right on the edge. Looks like I'm out of time. So this is what we think might be going on beneath the ice on Europa. We don't know, but this is what we think might be. So the best place in the solar system to look for life may very well be under the ice on Europa. And I love this quote by Arthur C. Clarke. Sometimes I think we're alone in the universe, and sometimes I think we're not. In either case, the idea is quite staggering. And this is something for us all to consider. I'm about 32 seconds away from being finished, Andreas. We need to fundamentally change the way we think about talent, putting less emphasis on predetermined sets of skills that we have, and we think that all of the people we are supposed to teach should have, and much more focus on the ability to acquire new ones. The entrepreneurial spirit has to guide us as we are in exponential growth curves of almost all sorts in both technology and populations. We need to be much, much more adaptive. And I think the kind of education that will be at our fingertips within 5 to 10 years will be something that these young ladies are looking at using global textures that are derived from what NOAA has put together in terms of science on a sphere. Conversations around holographic projections of vast amounts of data are not far-fetched. They're just not here right now. But this is the kind of thing that I believe both education and bull sessions, I mean, if you had a favorite favorite bar somewhere that had a table, you could set it up to do this, that would be the next generation of interactive ocean science. So I end with a quote from what has to be my favorite poet, which is Basho, Matsuo Basho. And it's turbulent the sea, stretching across to Sato, the Milky Way. And I love the fact that even almost 400 years ago, he juxtaposed the ocean, the turbulence of the ocean, and the cosmos. And in my view, many of the things we're doing in our own oceans today will be exported as we search for life beyond this planet. So I don't know if I've contributed to the search for energy within a new world, but maybe life within a new world will come about as a result of the research that we're engaged in. Thank you very much.